Hello everyone, welcome to the weekly lecture videos. In this video, we will start chapter 17, Working Capital Management. In this chapter, we will learn cash management and other aspects of working capital management. Commonly, responsibility for working capital is spread across several divisions. Accounting is frequently responsible for payables and receivables. Operations are in charge of inventory, and finance handles cash management. Marketing also plays a key role because sales forecasts are a key determinant of working capital needs. So, an understanding of working capital management is important for about everyone in the firm. In this chapter, we focus on working capital management. Probably you can remember from chapter 1 and from the previous chapter, that was chapter 16, that working capital management deals with a firm's short-term or current assets and liabilities. A firm's current liabilities consist largely of short-term financing that we have discussed in the previous chapter. So this chapter focuses mainly on current assets, particularly cash, account receivables, and inventory. So as usual, we have several learning objectives in this chapter. For example, we will learn about how firms manage cash and liquidity, receivables, and other components of credit. And we will also learn about inventory management system and how to determine the optimum inventory level. So as usual, I will be uploading separate videos on each of these learning objectives. So in this video, I will be concentrating on the first learning objectives, and I will discuss how firms manage their cash and liquidity. Let's start our understanding of the chapter by looking at how firms manage liquidity in the form of cash and cash-like assets, such as short-term marketable securities. The basic objective in liquidity management is to keep the investment in cash and cash-like assets as low as possible while still operating the firm's activities efficiently and effectively. Okay, the goal usually, this goal usually reduces to the dictum collect early and pay late. Okay, so when we refer to cash in this chapter, we take this into include short-term marketable securities. Okay, so now let's move to reasons for holding cash or cash-like assets. John Maynard Keynes, a great economist, in his great work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, identified 3 reasons for the importance of liquidity: the speculative motive, the precautionary motive, and the transaction motive. Okay, so we briefly discussed them. First of all is a speculative motive. The speculative motive is the need to hold liquidity in order to be able to take advantage of, for example, bargain purchase opportunities that might arise, attractive interest rates, and favorable exchange rate fluctuations. For most firms, reserve borrowing ability and marketable securities can be used to satisfy speculative motives. Thus, for a modern firm, there might be a speculative motive for liquidity, but not necessarily for cash per se. Okay. Then the precautionary motive. The precautionary motive is the need for a safety supply to act as a financial reserve. Once again, there is probably a precautionary motive for liquidity. However, given that the value of money market instrument is relatively certain, and the instruments such as bank bills are extremely liquid, there is no real need to hold substantial amount of cash for precautionary purposes. Okay. Then the transaction motive. Cash is needed to satisfy the transaction motive, the need to have cash on hand to pay bills. Okay, transaction-related needs come from the normal disbursement and collection activities of a firm. The disbursement of cash includes, as we have seen in the previous chapter, payment of wages, salaries, trade debts, taxes, and dividends. Cash is collected from sale of goods, sale of assets, and new financing. The cash inflows and outflows are not perfectly synchronized, as we know, and some level of liquidity is necessary to serve as a buffer. Perfect liquidity is the characteristic of cash that allows it to satisfy the transaction motive. Okay. As the banking system continues to innovate and other new form of payment transfers, such as electronic fund transfer and other high-speed paperless payment mechanisms continue to develop, even the transaction demand for cash may all but disappear. Okay, even if it does, however, there will still be a demand for liquidity and a need to manage it efficiently. Okay, so these are the most prominent motive, speculative motive, precautionary motive, and transaction motive to hold cash. Okay, now let's talk about benefits of liquidity. When a firm holds cash or short-term marketable securities in excess of some necessary minimum, it incurs an opportunity cost. The opportunity cost of excess cash is the interest income that could be earned in the next best use, such as investment in productive assets. Given the opportunity cost of holding liquidity, why would a firm hold excess liquidity? The answer is that cash or liquid balance must be maintained to provide the necessary funds for transaction needs, like paying bills. If the firm maintains too small a liquid balance, it may run out of liquidity. If this happens, the firm may have to raise cash on a short-term basis, and this could involve selling current assets or debts. Activities such as selling current assets or borrowing involve costs. Okay, so as we have discussed, that holding liquidity has an opportunity cost. Okay, and which is why the firm should optimize the holding of its liquidity. Okay, and the last point here is electronic data interchange. EDI is a general term that refers to the growing practice of direct electronic information exchange between all types of business. One important use of EDI is to transfer financial information, funds electronically between parties, and thereby eliminating paper invoices, paper checks, and so on. For example, it is now possible to arrange to have your bank account directly debited each month to pay many types of bills. And corporations now routinely directly deposit paychecks into employee bank accounts. Okay, so more generally, EDI allows a seller to send a bill electronically to a buyer, thereby avoiding the delays in using mail. The buyer can then electronically authorize payment and transfer the funds electronically to the seller's account at a different bank. The net effect is that the length of time required to initiate and complete a business transaction is shortened considerably. As the use of EDI increases, liquidity management will evolve to focus much more on issues surrounding computerized information exchange and fund transfers. Okay, so now let's talk about collection, disbursement, and investment of cash. As part of managing its cash and liquidity, a firm must make arrangements to collect from its customers, pay its suppliers, and invest any excess funds on hand. Okay, so let's briefly discuss them. First of all is cash collection. So that's what we are talking about. A firm always adopt procedures to speed up collections of debts and decrease collection times, even though this has already become a lot faster with the introduction of EDI that we discussed in the previous slide. How a firm collects from its customers depends in large part on the nature of the business. Okay, the simplest case would be a business such as a restaurant chain. Most of its customer will pay with cash, credit card, or electronic fund transfer. So there is no problem with delay. Okay, normally the funds would be deposited in a local bank, and the firm would have some means of gaining access to the funds. Okay, when some or all the payments a company receives are not made directly into the bank account, time becomes a relevant factor to consider. Okay. So cash concentration can result in significant savings. So what we are going to talk about, for example, with more than 350 legal entities operating in 118 countries and 1,000 bank accounts at different 100 banks, it is safe to say that Microsoft's cash was widely dispersed, right? Transferring money between banks by wire costs about $200 per transaction, an expensive proposition. Okay, in 2011, Microsoft helped develop a system that allowed for a daily sweep of its accounts by computer. As a result, wire transfer fees dropped by 41%, and the company recovered $105 million per day that had previously sat in sub accounts. Okay. Now, managing cash disbursements. From the firm's point of view, to help retain cash and liquidity, the goal is to slow down disbursement as much as possible, but not harm their credit rating. To do this, the firm may develop strategies for processing payments and procedure so as to minimize the need for liquidity for payment purposes. Okay, so first of all is controlling disbursement. A firm will wish to tie up as little liquidity as possible in disbursement. Firms have therefore developed systems to efficiently managing the disbursement process. The general idea in such system is to hold in the bank no more than the minimum amount necessary to pay bills. Okay, so we will discuss some approaches to accomplish this goal next. For example, zero balance accounts. With a zero balance account, the firm incorporation with its bank maintains a master account and a set of sub accounts. Okay. When a check is written or electronic payment is to be made in one of the sub accounts, the necessary funds are transferred in from the master account. Okay. So look at this diagram to understand how it works. Look, in this case, the firm maintains two disbursement accounts, one for suppliers and one for payroll. So you can say one for supplier and one for payroll. Okay. As shown, if the firm does not use zero balance account, each of these accounts must have a safety stock of cash to meet unanticipated demands. If the firm does use zero balance accounts, it can keep one safety stock in a master account. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about. Safety stock in a master account and transfer the funds to the two subsidiary accounts as needed. The master account earns interest at a similar rate to short-term deposits with the bank. The key is that the total amount of cash held as a buffer is smaller under zero balance account, which frees up cash to be used elsewhere. Now, investing idle cash. If a firm has a temporary liquidity surplus, it can invest in short-term securities. As we have mentioned in previous videos, the market for current financial asset is called the money market. The maturity of current financial asset that trade in the money market is 1 year or less. Okay, so most large firms manage their own current financial assets, transacting through banks and dealers. Some large firms and many small firms use a fund manager. The fund manager will invest the funds in current financial assets for a management fee. The management fee is compensation for the professional expertise and diversification provided by the fund manager. Okay, so among the many money market fund managers, there are some that specialize in corporate customers. Okay, in addition, banks offer arrangements in which the bank takes all excess available funds at the close of each business day and invest them for the firm. Okay, so let's talk about temporary cash surpluses. Firms have temporary liquidity surplus for various reasons. Two of the most important are the financing of seasonal or cyclical activities and planned or possible expenditures. Okay. Seasonal or cyclical activities. Some firms have a predictable cash flow pattern, right? So they have surplus cash flows during part of the year and deficit cash flows the rest of the year. Okay, so for example, David Jones, a department store company, has several cash flow patterns influenced by Christmas. Okay, a firm such as David Jones may buy marketable securities when surplus cash flow occurs and sell marketable securities when deficit occurs. Okay, of course, bank loans are another short-term financing instrument. And the second point is the planned or possible expenditure. Firms frequently accumulate temporary investments in marketable securities to provide the cash for a planned construction program, dividend payment, or other large expenditure. So thus, firms may issue bonds and shares before the cash is needed, investing the proceeds in short-term marketable securities, and then selling the securities to finance the expenditures. Okay, so also firms may face the possibility of having to make a large cash outlay. Okay, so an obvious example would be the possibility of losing a large lawsuits. Firms may build up cash surpluses against such a contingents. So this figure essentially illustrates the seasonal or cyclical activities that I was talking about. So the use of bank loans and marketable securities to meet temporary financing needs is illustrated here. Okay, so you see that in this case, a firm is following a compromise working capital policy in the sense that we have discussed in the previous chapters. Okay. So now you can see here it is time. So this permanent requirement of short-term asset is financed by long-term financing. Okay, and some of them are also financed by short-term financing. Okay, and now when there is additional demand, additional short-term demand, those are financed by bank loans or by issuing marketable securities. Okay, now characteristics of short-term securities. Given that a firm has some temporary idle cash, there are a variety of short-term securities available for investing. The most important characteristics of these short-term marketable securities are their maturity, default risk, maturity, the default risk, and marketability. Okay. First of all is maturity. Maturity refers to the period over which interest and principal payments are made. Okay. If you remember in chapter 6, we learned that for a given change in the level of interest rates, the price of longer maturity securities will change more than those of shorter maturity securities. As a consequence, firms often limit their investments in marketable securities to those maturing in less than 90 days to avoid the risk of losses in value from changing interest rates. Default risk refers to the probability that interest and principal will not be paid in the promised amounts on the due dates. Okay. Of course, some securities have negligible default risk, such as Australian government bonds and bank bills. Given the purposes of investing idle corporate cash, firms typically avoid investing in marketable securities with significant default risk. The last point, marketability. Marketability refers to how easy it is to convert an asset to cash. Okay, so marketability and liquidity mean much the same thing. Some money market instruments are much more marketable than others. At the top of the list are government bonds, which can be bought and sold very cheaply and very quickly. So we are almost towards the end of this video. So the last topic that we discuss here is some different types of money market securities. Once again, if you recall, we learned from chapter 6 that money market securities are generally both short-term and highly marketable, as they usually have a low rate of default or low risk of default. They are issued by government, domestic or foreign banks, or business corporations. There are many types in all, and let's talk about the most common one. First of all is certificates of deposits. So certificate of deposit, CDs, are short-term loans to banks. There are active markets in CDs of 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and 12-month maturities. Commercial bills are bills of exchange, and the short-term securities issued by corporations. These are negotiable instruments, which means that once issued, these bills can be bought and sold. Typically, commercial bills are unsecured. Maturities ranges from 90 to 180 days. There are two types of bills, bank bills and non-bank bills. A bank bill is the one which is accepted or endorsed by a bank. That means where a bank guarantees the payment. There is an active secondary market in bank bills due to their creditworthiness, okay, as the bank guarantees payment. Promissory notes are promises to pay a lender an amount of money in the future and are issued for short terms. The default risk of promissory notes depends on the financial strength of the issuer. Okay. So this is the end of this video where we talked about cash and liquidity management. Okay, so in the next video, we will be talking about firms' credit policy components. Thank you very much.